Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga, kia mā kina kina kiota, kia mā taratara ki tai. E hia ki ana te tākura he tio, he huka, he hohunga, homie, huie, tai kie. E aku nui e aku rahi tēnei te mihi maiha kia koutou, kei te mihi a hoki ho kāinga o tēnei rohe, ara ko nai tua huriri, nā rātou iti aki a hau. Ko Hudson Te Awa, ko Aotearoa Te Kāinga, no Horana me Porana o Kutipuna, I tipua ke aho ki New Loka City, engari he hononga hoki aho ki Akatina. Kei o tautahi aho no hoana, ko Kaila Colbin toku ingoa, mauritu, mauri ora, tēnā koutou katoa. Greetings and welcome. It is such a delight to be back with our Global Women whānau, our Global Women Wahine Toa. I'm Kaila Colbin and welcome to this session on trust. Thank you. I know when you arrived, if you were alone in the room, it might have seemed quite startling to have your video on. I will invite you to turn on your video. It makes actually, you might not realize this, but it makes a massive difference to me to be able to see your smiling faces when we're running these sessions. So lovely to see you. Thank you very much for doing that. I so appreciate it. Yeah, we're going to have we have a wonderful hour ahead. It's going to go, I think, pretty quickly. Yeah, great to be here. So I want to quickly cover how this material came about, because what we're going to be doing is we're going to be unpacking the elements of trust, the definition of trust, what we mean when we say trust, and how we can activate that deeper understanding to increase the levels of trust in our organizations and in our relationships. So where does this come from? I think many of you know that a little over a year ago, almost a year and a half ago, I traveled to Texas and had the great privilege of training with Brené Brown to facilitate her Dare to Lead curriculum. Brené is a research professor at the University of Houston, where she holds the Brené Brown Huffington Endowed Chair. She's written 5 global bestsellers. She's given a couple of TED Talks, one of them among the top 5 most viewed of all time. She's got a Netflix special out. She's kind of a celebrity academic, and what she studies is courage, empathy, vulnerability, and shame. And so the training that I did was to be able to facilitate her work specifically in the organizational context. And since then, I've facilitated this material for over 800 people, and it just gets deeper and deeper and richer and richer. And the reason for that is, I believe, the methodology that she uses for her research. So when I went to do the training with her, you know, she has a pretty large following. She's got a few million followers. She has a lot of people who are very strong fans, a lot of super fans. I did not go as a super fan, as an unmitigated fangirl. I went as I'm curious and open to hear what I can learn. And what I found is that the research is robust. The insights that get generated are robust. And as a result, the material becomes applicable in a much wider range of contexts than I otherwise would have thought. So the research methodology that she uses is a methodology called grounded theory. And the way that it works is pretty straightforward. She'll take a concept like trust that we all talk about as being important, but that often means different things to different people or means different things in different contexts. And she'll ask people, she'll ask the 50 people on this call, she'll ask 100, 1,000, 5,000 people, what does trust mean to you? And every individual thing that someone says about that concept gets captured as a data point. When they did vulnerability, for example, they started their research with 200,000 data points about what vulnerability meant to people. They grew that data set to 400,000 data points. And they take all of those data points and they organize them into categories. And the critical thing about that methodology is that there can be no outliers. And so what ends up being generated in the end is a framework that reflects everything anyone has ever told them about trust or about vulnerability or about courage. And that is the background for the material that we're going to cover today. So here's how it's going to work. When it comes to trust, we have 7 elements of trust. Those elements form an acronym. The acronym is BRAVING. We're going to go through each of those 7 elements. I invite you to take notes as we go. We'll share in the general chat a brief definition of each one of the elements as we run through it. So you'll have the name of that element and its definition, but any notes as it applies to you are over to you. I invite you at any point in time, feel free to use the hand raise function. If you click on the participants button at the bottom of the Zoom and then go over to the right, you'll see there's an opportunity to raise your hand via Zoom. Feel free to use that function at any time if you have a question. If you use that hand raise function, it does bring it to my attention. So that's a useful feature. So anytime you've got a question, feel free to use that hand raise function. Feel free to ask questions at any time via the chat. You can ask those questions. Excuse me, I got some makeup in my eye, I believe, and it's aggravating. This is how you know this session is not pre-recorded. Use the hand raise function, use the chat function. You can ask questions in the chat function. You can ask questions to that are open to the general public to see, or you can ask questions to me privately, and I will answer your question without stating who you are if you have a question that you don't want to be tied to. We're going to go through those 7 elements. When we get through the 7 elements, towards the end, I'm going to invite you into breakout rooms to discuss what you've heard and to share any insights or observations. I will, and then we'll bring you back from those breakout rooms with around 10 minutes to spare at the end for you to bring any questions back from the breakout rooms that you may have. Sound good? Get the bye? Keep going? Okay. So braving trust. Braving is the acronym. I will confess, it is one of those acronyms that is slightly forced. They took the elements and there's at least one where they kind of had to make it work for the word that they wanted. And you'll see that as we get to it, but it is a useful mnemonic device. So I am a fan of it. And the acronym starts with B, and the B is for boundaries. Now, I will tell you, I found that fascinating when I first heard that the first element was boundaries. And the reason I found it so fascinating is because it's not at all what I think of when I think about trust. When I think about trust, what I think about is that you do what you say you're going to do. You know, you show up when you say you're going to show up, and you don't tell my secrets. Right? Those are the 2 things that come to mind for me. Like, can I count on you? And are you gonna, if I tell you something, are you gonna be trusted with that information? But the more that I've done this work, the more I've come to realize how essential boundaries are and how foundational they are to our entire experience of trust. And to demonstrate this, I'd love to do a little role play. Now we've got 55 people on the call, and 2, 4, 6, 8 of you have answered my call to courage to turn your videos on. And so I'm going to reward you with a greater level of vulnerability. Is any one of you willing to do a bit of a role play with me? Show of hand if you're willing to do it. Excellent. Okay, Linda, thank you. I'm going to turn you off mute here. Kia ora, Linda. How's it going?
Good, thank you.
Awesome, thanks. Thanks for being willing to do the role play. Here's how the role play is going to work. In this scenario, you work for me, okay? And you really want to do a good job. You really want to please me. Your 2 core values are reliability and teamwork. You just, you don't want to let me down, okay? All good? You're in character? Need a moment to get into, you're good? Okay, awesome. All right, so, hey, Linda, have you managed to get the campaign out? I know that was supposed to go out by this afternoon. Has that gone?
Absolutely, yep.
Okay, awesome. And were you able to run the analysis on the previous campaign? Because I know it was super important to be able to inform that to use that information to inform the next campaign.
Yep.
Okay, cool. And are you going to be able to get the, I've got the board meeting on Wednesday, and I needed the report done on our marketing activity for the past 3 months. Are you going to be able to get that done for me by Monday? Because I have to have a chance to review it before the board meeting.
Yep, that would be fine.
Awesome. Okay, cool. One more thing. I know we're doing the rebrand that we've been working on. And I know you got a lot on, but we were planning to get the rebrand done, I think by Tuesday. Are we going to be able to get that done? It's super important. And I'd love to be able to go into the board meeting with, an update on where we sit with that.
I think that might be delayed a wee bit.
Okay, okay. But it's super important to me, and I know, it's something that's really critical for the team. So do you think you might be able to get that done?
Well, I don't think we're going to be able to get it done by Tuesday. If we need to get the other stuff done by Monday.
Okay, but let's assume that you're somebody who really wants to get it done by Tuesday. Do you think you might be able to get that done for me?
Probably need a bit of help on it. If you could
Okay.
allocate a few more people, perhaps we could give it a go.
Okay, awesome. Excellent. Thank you, Linda. I think we've demonstrated the relationship sufficiently. A big show of jazz hands for Linda's performance. Thank you. Awesome. All right, we'll put you back on mute there. So I'm going to ask, and you can check your answers in the chat here. So one of the things that you'll notice is that towards the end of that exchange, Linda started to set some boundaries in place. In many situations, fair to say, people might find it difficult to set boundaries such as that. And so what I want you to do is imagine a situation where the person that we're talking to does not have the self-confidence to be able to set those boundaries, right? This is a global women group, a lot of self-confidence in this hui right now, often dealing with people who don't have that assurance, that self-confidence to be able to set those boundaries. So let's imagine that we're dealing with someone who does not have that level of confidence. And what I want you to do is just chuck in the chat, how do you think that person would be feeling if I were to keep going the way that I was going with my incessant requests? How do you think that person would be feeling? Resentful, worried? Yep, absolutely. Overwhelmed, set up for failure, worried, under stress, pressured, put upon, worn down, wanting to give in, frustrated, pressured. Yeah, absolutely. Angry. Yep, not seen. 100%. All of these things. How do you think that person, so we've got a couple that would be, how would that person feel about me? We've got angry, resentful. Any other thoughts on how that person would feel about me as a boss? Annoyed, totally, of course. Intimidated, yep, yeah, I'm putting a lot of pressure on. Dominated, 100%. Inspired, that's interesting. Boss doesn't value me. Clueless, lack of respect, yep. Used, lack of understanding. Yeah, I had selfish, totally. I had someone tell me once that they would feel that if I were asking for these things and I'm the boss, they must be possible. And therefore, if they weren't able to deliver on all of those things, this person said that she would turn, quote, all the shame and shitty feelings on herself, as being, it would be clear evidence that she's not capable. What is likely to ultimately happen if we continue down this vein? What's gonna be the net result, the outcome? Burnout, yep. Burnout, disengagement, Disengagement, person will leave the job. Mistakes will happen, absolutely. You'll start dropping balls. And so basically, and potentially mental health at risk, absolutely. They learn to become uber efficient. Well-being outside of work also impacted, taking on too much, not succeeding objectives. Yeah. So basically, what's likely to happen is this person, if I continue with the level of pressure, and what we're assuming here is it's to Linda's point about them becoming uber efficient, what we're assuming here is a level of pressure that is greater than what the person is capable of effectively responding to, right? That's the dynamic that we're describing. What ultimately is likely to happen is the person will either blow up, get sick, or leave, or some combination of those three things, right? So here is what I have come to understand about boundaries and why they are so important to trust. There is no way for me to trust your yes if I cannot also trust that you will say no when no needs to be said. I cannot trust your yes if I don't have confidence that you'll say no when no is the answer. And right off the bat, you could see in my encounter with Linda, how as soon as she's saying this is going to be delayed because I'm not going to get to it, for me as the boss, that's going to increase my level of trust in her because she's set a clear boundary about what she is and isn't able to deliver, right? Now you could argue, and rightly so, that the boss in this role play was being unreasonable and being a terrible boss. And that would absolutely be true, right? But one critical thing to remember in all of this work is that we cannot control the behavior of a single person other than ourselves. We cannot control the behavior of a single person other than ourselves. And so if we're thinking about what is within our power, what is within our agency in order to be more trustworthy, then our ability to set and maintain boundaries becomes paramount. Okay, so that's the B. Let's move on. We'll go to the R. The R in Braving stands for reliability and closely related to the B, right? If you don't set clear boundaries, then you are likely to become less reliable. Reliability is doing what you say you're going to do, being clear about what you take on and what you don't take on, and being able to deliver what you say you're going to deliver. And the A is closely related to both the B and the R. The A is for accountability. And so you can imagine, you can imagine a scenario where I might say, Melissa, I'm so sorry I didn't get that report to you. I should have been clear that I didn't have the capacity to do that. And therefore I let you down. I own that. Let me do what I need to do to make it right. So didn't set clear boundaries, therefore was not reliable. Now taking accountability for both of those things, owning my mistakes, apologizing, making amends, doing what I need to do to make it right. The V in Braving is where the acronym becomes slightly problematic. The V stands for vault. A better word for vault would probably be confidentiality. And what we mean by vault is simply that you don't share information that is not yours to share, right? Not only that you don't share my information. This is, as I said right at the beginning, when I think about trust, I think about the two things that come to mind for me are reliability and confidentiality, right? That you do what you say you're going to do and you don't tell my secrets. But something that I hadn't thought about as much before I did this work was that it's not only about whether you'll tell my secrets, but also whether you'll tell me someone else's secrets, right? And when we allow people to share information with us that is not theirs to share, we are investing in those people being less trustworthy. We are enabling those people to be less trustworthy. The I stands for integrity. And integrity simply means choosing courage over comfort, choosing what is right over what is fun, fast, or easy, and choosing to live our values rather than simply profess them. Integrity comes from the Latin word integrare, which simply means to make whole. And to me, what integrity is that, no matter which angle you look at someone, you see the picture is still coherent, right? They're not saying one thing to you and a different thing to somebody else. The N in Braving stands for non-judgment. Non-judgment. If I tell you something that is intimate and personal, if I tell you something that makes me vulnerable to share it, then I need to know that you will respond without judgment. And if you do respond with judgment, then the trust between us is going to be diminished. And the G is for generosity. And what we mean by generosity is generosity of assumption, generosity of interpretation, right? If I tell you, if I am 5 minutes late to our meeting, is your assumption that I don't care and I don't respect you? Or is your assumption that I respect you plenty, but there was a car accident that delayed me because of traffic, right? What is the most generous interpretation of the intentions, words, and actions of others? Rosaria, I've got my colleague Rosaria on the call here. She's the one behind the Global Women logo there. Rosaria, I might ask you to, you've been putting those individually, but I know there was a gap with the B for braving because everyone put their answers for how I was feeling. So can I ask you to just dump the full 7, and people can copy paste as they wish in the chat. So thank you, that's great. I shared this model with a group pretty early on when I started facilitating this material, and I had a guy say to me, you know, I'm looking at this list and I'm really struggling with it. I'm struggling with non-judgment and generosity. And he says, and I'm thinking about a pedophile. Okay, not what I would generally think about, but okay. He says, I'm thinking about a pedophile and I can't imagine how I could possibly extend non-judgment and generosity towards that person. And I said, well, that's fine. You don't have to. You may not be able to. But then, of course, you wouldn't have a high trust relationship with that person, right? So these elements are not, this is not about you need to display all of these elements at all times with all people. What we're saying here is these are the elements that if they are present, there will be high trust. And if they are not present, there will be low or no trust. Now, we could get into a lot of semantic discussions about, are they additive or are they multiplicative? In other words, if there's a 0 on any one of these, does that mean there can't be trust at all across all of them? To me, those arguments are kind of semantic arguments that sort of veer away from the usefulness of the model, because the usefulness of the model is when we're in a situation when we're starting to feel a bit of a lack of trust, being able to pin down with specificity and tangibility what exactly is the behavior that is driving this feeling, right? And what exactly would we need to do specifically in order to increase the trust between us, right? I'm sure we've all been in situations where someone said, oh, it just feels like you don't trust me, or it feels like, you know, we don't have, there's no trust with the SLT, or there's no trust with the board, or there's no trust with whatever. And it's hard to really pin down what we mean by that. And using this framework allows us to start to pin down and get really practical and specific with what we're talking about. So we have a question here from Wendy. Thank you for your question. What if you feel that the other person doesn't trust you? How do you shift this? So the first thing, thank you for that question. It's a really good one. The first thing I will say is to repeat something I said earlier, which is that we cannot change the behavior of a single other person on this planet. We can't change people's minds. We can't change people's hearts. We can't force people to want to show up the way we want them to show up. And it's something that, I'll tell you what, one of the reasons I feel so privileged to facilitate this material is that every time I facilitate it, it's always a reminder to myself of all of it, right? And that thing in particular is one that I have to constantly remind myself of, right? Like I will show up in a difficult conversation and I'm hoping the other person is going to be ready to lean into vulnerability and own their part, and that's how I'm wanting to show up. And sometimes the other person just isn't, right? That's not where they're at. They're not interested. And I constantly have to go back and say, okay, can I use this material as a magic wand to change someone else's behavior? So that's the first kind of unsatisfying response to your question, but there's a little bit more to it than that. So we can't change someone's behavior, except that what we can do is start to use this framework to really articulate potentially what the challenge is. And if the other person is up for it, right? If the other person is you know, if you've got a situation where you feel the other person doesn't trust you, and they're willing to engage in a conversation about why that might be, what might be driving that, how you might be able to rectify that, then you can potentially use this framework to go and sit down with this person and say, hey, I've always had a sense that you didn't quite trust me. And I've gone through this framework. And now what I realize is that the thing that seems to be coming up over and over again is that you seem to feel I'm unreliable. And here are the 3 or 4 times that, you've demonstrated that why I'm interpreting it this way. Here are the 3 or 4 things that you said that, lead me to believe that. First of all, can I just check in? Is that story that I've just made up accurate, or is it not? Is there something else there? And what would I need to do in order to address this and make sure that we have a trusting relationship going forward, right? Now, like I said, the other person might come into that conversation and go, what are you talking about? I trust you fine. And you might still feel like, oh, they're not quite being honest. And you might end up going around in circles. But if you have someone who is willing to engage in an open conversation like that, then being able to really explicitly articulate, this is what, if I say to you, I feel like you don't trust me, it's a pretty ambiguous statement. If I say to you, I'm concerned that you don't trust me, and I've been looking at the meaning of trust and all of its different elements, and specifically the thing that it keeps coming up is that it feels like you don't trust my integrity. And here's a specific example of what that has looked like and how I've interpreted it. And I could be wrong about this, so I want to have an open conversation with you about, number one, whether my interpretation is accurate, and number two, if it is, what we can do to work through it so that we can have a more constructive relationship. That's an incredibly empowering position to be coming from. So thank you for that question, Wendy. We have a question from Karen. Given the methodology of grounded theory, do we assume that all elements are applicable for all people? Or can we consider that different elements are more or less important to different people? That is a great question. It is definitely the latter. It is absolutely the latter. One of the things that we've been doing, we have such a short time together today, but one of the things that we've been doing in our larger and longer groups is we have people come into those groups, and before we go through the elements, we have our participants write down, what does trust mean to them? And they'll write it down on Post-it notes, and they'll use a different Post-it for each different thing that they're saying trust means to them. And then we go through the 7 elements, and then we have them organize their Post-it notes as a table according to the 7 elements. And what we end up with is, it's not a bell curve, it's a distribution chart, a distribution map of how many Post-its came up for kind of each one of the elements. And what we find is that, typically there'll be a table that, there'll be one of the elements they don't even have a single Post-it for, right? Like I said, I hadn't thought about boundaries at all as an element of trust before doing this work. So 100% different elements, more or less important to different people. They'll vary across cultures. You might have a culture where being reliable in the form of being on time is hugely important to your ability to trust people. And in other cultures, you might have a cultural expectation that people will be 10, 15, 20 minutes, half an hour late, and that would not affect your trust in someone at all, because that is a cultural norm. So 100% different across people and different across cultures. Thank you for that question. Lisa, in a team situation, how would you discuss what each person's understanding of trust is so you start having a similar vocabulary to talk about trust? Great question. So in a team situation, I would do almost exactly what we've just described. So I would have the team members write down, what do they think of when they think about trust. I would have them, and I would be kind of explicit to say that what we're looking for is in terms of definitions of trust, right? Because sometimes people will write things like, oh, trust is hard work. Yeah, that's hard work, but that's not a definition of it, right? Like that's a characteristic of it, a meta characteristic of it. So I'd have them write all that down, again, one per Post-it note, and then I'd share with them, these are the 7 elements of trust according to Brené Brown's research. And I'd invite them to go, okay, like how do the things that you think about trust align to these 7 elements? I would also have them do something that I'm going to invite you to do shortly, which is to reflect on, pick at least one of these elements and reflect on, pick at least one of these elements, pick someone with whom you have a professional relationship, and then reflect on, with this person, think of a time when you displayed this element of trust, right? Let's say you're the chief executive and you're thinking about your board chair. When was a time that you displayed boundaries? What was the outcome and how did it feel? When was a time when you did not display this element? What was the outcome and how did it feel? Right? And start to get them really thinking intentionally about this stuff. One of the things that I find is that when it comes to conversations about trust, about values, about courage, about vulnerability, that many people are reluctant to look closely at what specifically we mean by these words, right? And so people might say things to me like, well, you know, we share the same values. And I'll go, really? How do you know? Like, seriously, have we had a conversation about specifically what your value? We like each other. We enjoy talking to each other. Great. But unless we've had a specific conversation about what your values are and what my values are, we don't really know that we share the same values, right? Or someone might say something like, well, you know, I want to have a culture of courage, without really getting specific and tangible about what we mean by that. And so the more specific we can get, and the more we can encourage our teams to get really specific and really tangible and practical about these things, the more powerful this work will become, and the more you'll start to see the results, because then your team, I want to just tell you a story actually of what this looks like in practice. Once you get your team understanding the same things, and once you start to normalize this vocabulary, these frameworks, and this kind of conversation, how powerful this can become. What you can do is you can start to generate teams where the full team is lifting each other up to be accountable to the higher standards that you aspire to. So here's my story. So one of the things to know before I tell you this story is that when we email, can we all agree that email is like possibly the worst form of communication, especially for anything difficult, right? Fair? Like anything slightly difficult, if there's even the smidgen of like a lack of trust in a relationship, email is going to be the worst possible way to address it, right? So my observation is that the reason that email is so terrible in this way is because when we write an email, we write an email in a particular tone of voice. As we're writing, we're hearing it in our heads, and we're hearing it with a particular tone of voice, right? Like, kia ora, Anna, just checking in on that report and seeing how you're going, gentle nudge, right? When we read email, we read it in a particular tone of voice, right? Like as we're reading, we hear it in our head, and we hear a tone of voice in our head. And very often, the tone of voice in which the email gets read fails to match the tone of voice in which the email was written, right? So I'm going, kia ora, Anna, just a gentle nudge, just want to check in on that report. And Anna's reading, kia ora, Anna, gentle nudge, checking in on the report, right? And so totally different tone of voice, and we end up having a big battle. Okay. So I come back from Texas from doing all this training. I share it all with my team. And about a week after I'm back, we're just heading into a team meeting. And I receive an email that is just, I mean, I'm sure I'm not the only person on this call who has received emails that just bring out the frilly-necked dinosaur in you, the frilly-necked lizard, and you're just like, all of a sudden it's like, you think I'm Kaila, but actually I'm like, Kaila, the monster, right? So I get this email that's just like really hits every one of my hot buttons. And I'll tell you what the email was. So BOMA New Zealand is part of a global BOMA group. BOMA New Zealand had just redone our website. Any of you who've ever been involved in a website redesign, you know it's a big headache of a project. We'd just gotten to the end of it. We were about to launch it. BOMA Global Group asked us for a sneak preview of it because they needed to see it for some other stuff that they were doing. We sent them the sneak preview and they took it upon themselves to send us some helpful feedback just as we're about to go live. So this helpful feedback email comes in, and I can tell you that the tone of voice that I received this email in was not in any way charitable. So we go into the team meeting and I say to the team, I just got this email and I'm feeling super frustrated. I'm feeling really angry and resentful about it. Like I'm really irritated. I just wanted you to know that, before we go into this team meeting. And somebody on my team says to me, what would be the most generous interpretation of this email? And I was like, damn it, don't teach people things. Like, why did I tell you this information? And then someone else on the team says, why don't you try reading it to us in a nice tone of voice? And I was like, don't teach people things. Like, can't you just be, indignant and self-righteous along with me and like just agree that this is a terrible email? So I'm like, no, I'm up for it. I'll do it. So I take a few deep breaths and I'm like, okay, I'm going to read it in a nice tone of voice. And I can really strongly recommend this exercise. But what I will tell you is that if you're going to do this exercise, you have to do it legit. You cannot secretly do it in a passive aggressive tone of voice. You know what I'm talking about, right? Okay, so take a few deep breaths. I'm like, I'm going to read this email. It's going to be a nice tone of voice. Okay, here we go. Hi, Kaila. Thanks so much for sending through the website for us. It looks amazing. We have a couple of small bits of feedback for you. Totally up to you whether you want to use them or not. We know you're about to go live. We really just wanted to share so you had a chance to act on them if you wanted to. But, as we say, totally up to you. So here's our feedback. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Read the email. Get to the end. My team's like, that doesn't sound so bad. And I'm like, come on, I wanted you to be angry along with me. My point is, it wasn't so bad if I applied generosity and if I could use the most generous interpretation by applying a nice tone of voice. My point here, the bigger point here, is that this is what it looks like when you start to share this vocabulary and these frameworks with a team around you. And like I said, you can start to hold each other to account for the aspiration that you have for your own trustworthiness within your team. All right, Mel, you're going to have to unmute yourself.
Thank you. We were just reflecting on your example, and it's a really helpful one because I think with some of these things, we probably all, as you identified, have blind spots at different points, depending on a whole lot of other things, how we're feeling about things, what's happened directly before, how tired you are, etc. And it's really helpful, isn't it, to have others who can help you identify or hold up the aspiration around all of those things that we might not be able to bring our best selves to at every point in time. Because I don't think anyone's completely kind of on with all of those things all of the time. So having a network around you of others that can help you to be your best and to help step into the fold when I know I can't be my best is certainly something that's really helpful. Yeah, it's such a great insight. Thank you for sharing that. And it's so true, right? None of us is our best self at all times. I remember, it's a bit random, but there's a Vietnamese Buddhist monk called Thich Nhat Hanh who is just, he's well elderly now and had a pretty severe stroke a few years back, but he's written over 100 books. He was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize by Martin Luther King Jr. Like, he's just a guiding light. And I remember just after 9/11 reading an interview with him where he was asked, what would you do if you were had the opportunity to have a conversation with Osama bin Laden? And he said, well, the first thing I would do is make sure that I had other members of my Sangha, other members of my community with me to help me remember to breathe. And I read that to my brother-in-law. I was with my brother-in-law when I read this, and I said to him, and he said, that's so interesting because I would think that guy, like he wouldn't forget, right? And it's the kind of that sort of realization of, when you think you're good enough that you don't need that support is when you're just
at the beginning of your journey. The Olympic athletes all have coaches. The best chief executives all have coaches, right? That like we all need that constant support to be the people that we know we are capable of being. We did a pretty significant piece of work at BOMA, New Zealand, in terms of our organizational culture, articulating our organizational culture and what's important to us. And we didn't call it culture, we didn't call it values, we called it behavioral aspirations. And it says really explicitly in there that we know we are all human, we know we will not get this right all the time, that, you know, some days we'll have our good days and some days will not be our best days. But these are the things that we commit to in terms of our aspirations, and we commit to holding ourselves and each other accountable for these things. So if we don't practice them, we're holding ourselves to account for those things. And as you say, you know, all sorts of factors will go into whether we're going to be our best selves on any given day or not. How much sleep did we have? How much, you know, what's our prior history with this person? What else is going on in our lives? I used to be married, and my now ex-husband, when we were married, used to say to me, like we'd get into an argument and he'd say to me, "Oh, you're just getting your period." And nothing would infuriate me more than that, other than getting my period the next day. And I, you know, it was like this moment of like reckoning of like, oh, you know, I felt like I didn't want to be that cliche person that like, you know, I'm being affected by this. And of course I'm affected by it. I am a human being with a human body and hormones, and, you know, these things, they affect us. So being attentive to when we have the internal resource to be able to live up to these and when we don't, and then owning that, right? So that accountability piece can apply to any of the other elements. You know, the other day we showed up, I said something to you that I should not have said. I feel badly about it. I'm going to tell that person that I told you this thing, and I would like to ask you to not, you know, feel free to stop me if I'm going to say something inappropriate in the future, right? The other day, I said something about somebody that was pretty judgmental. That is not who I want to be. That was wrong of me to say. I own that. I'm going to do my level best to not do it in the future. If you ever hear me talking like that, feel free to call me out on it, right? Because I aspire to behaving in this way, and sometimes I need support to get that done. Leanne, interesting how choosing to reframe or frame impacted your physiological response to a situation. Awesome. Did you want to say anything about that? Feel free to unmute yourself.
Oh, no, it was just interesting to the situation. The slightly less positive situation was where I'd done a very detailed technical document and I was wanting some feedback. I hadn't got the feedback on time and I got it last minute, and there was just pages and pages and pages of feedback, and it was really detailed, and it was the, you know, not only was it technical feedback, he decided he'd help me with all my grammar as well, which wasn't what I needed at that particular point. And I was just so frustrated, whereas reframing it from his perspective, he was being really helpful because he'd given me all this really fabulous, and he put a lot of time and energy into it. And even talking about it, just the no to kind of, thanks for that. Might not take all of it on board, but you know, he had gone out of his way to do what I asked him to do.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for that reframing. And I love that you raised the physiological aspect of it, because one of the things that we often miss is that we think about feelings as these sort of intangible things, like, oh, that's just a feeling, that's not real, or oh, it's all in your head, it's not, you know, you're not actually sick, it's psychosomatic or whatever. But we are feeling machines that think, and literally we cannot have a feeling without it being a physical experience. The only way we know we are having a feeling is that we have a physical response. And I'll share with you what I mean by that with the 2 minutes that we have left. So if you've ever done any kind of writing course, any kind of creative writing, nonfiction, doesn't matter. The first mantra of writing is always show, don't tell, right? Show, don't tell. And the best explanation I've ever gotten for the difference between the two, imagine that I am telling you a story and I say, Nissy walked into the old mansion and immediately felt scared. You'll be like, Okay, I guess I'll take your word for it, right? But imagine instead that I say, Nissy walked into the old mansion and immediately the hairs on the back of her neck went up. And her heart started pounding and her mouth went dry and her palms went clammy. Now I don't have to tell you that she's scared. You know that she's scared because I've shown you the physical experience of being scared, and you can feel that in your own body. And so our ability to be attentive to the physicality of our feelings will give us, it unlocks a superpower of noticing, oh, there was a feeling of a lack of trust. How did that physically feel in my body? How did I know that I felt uncomfortable? What was that like? Oh, let me bring my attention to it. It's my heart, it's my tummy, it's my chest, it's my breathing, it's my, my shoulders, whatever it may be. Those become the flags that help us, again, become super specific of like, oh, wow, when that person said something, I noticed my heart started beating faster. What's that about? Oh, when I investigate, I find it's because what they said conveyed a lack of generosity of interpretation about what I had said, and therefore was an indicator to me that that person might not trust me. There must be something there. I better go sort it out. With that, team, we are out of time. I knew the hour would go quickly. It's been an absolute delight spending this session with you. I appreciate all of your contributions, your questions, showing up in the breakout rooms. It's been wonderful. And I look forward to seeing you again on a future Global Women session. Ka kite ano.